Goethe was, in many of his works, very concerned about our inability to face up to our own weaknesses and, in a sense, missing parts. And he thinks of this as a failure of friendship. In one of his plays, which is based on the life of the Italian poet Tasso, he splits the human experience into two parts, one of which is called Tasso and is the poetic part, and the other is called Antonio, who is a courtier, a diplomat, and is the prudent, practical, responsible part. And he describes, in the play, Goethe describes the Tasso's very antagonistic relationship to Antonio. The kindest people in the play look on and think, why can't these two men, Tasso and Antonio, why can't they be friends? They seem to have so much to offer one another. Wouldn't it be wonderful if they could combine their talents and serve us by combining them, help us by combining their abilities? The sensitivity of one, the imagination of one, combining with the prudence and the acquired wisdom of the other. But it's tremendously difficult for them to do this because of envy and of fear that if they get close, they'll humiliate one another. That as it were, the poetic Tasso will be humiliated by the practical experience of Antonio. That in certain questions, in certain areas, his sensitivity, his imagination are of no help. What should the state do about its relation to Rome? Don't ask Tasso. He doesn't know. But for Tasso, that's too humiliating. He can't bear a limitation on the significance of his own inner life. He wants to be able to spin out from within himself solutions to all of life's problems. And he says that's the problem, that's the difficulty. That the poetic part of the self, in a way, wants to spread out too far. But on the other hand, Antonio can't bear certain things about Tasso. There's a moment of declaration of moral independence that the poet makes. He says that, my values are not just dependent upon who happens to pay me for writing, who my patron is, so on. I'm devoted to something more noble, more lofty. And for Antonio, the pragmatist, this is very threatening, very upsetting. And the two end up having a sword fight. And this dramatizes the conflict between them. Now it turns out to be a tragic story because it's only under the most terrible stress, in fact, of Tasso's almost madness, that he begins at last to recognize that these two parts could in fact go together. I think that as a writer, Goethe was trying to give himself an image of his own worst fears. That the poetic side of himself, the very sort of freewheeling, experimental part of himself, just would never be able to join up with the practical, serious, responsible part of himself. He was terrified that he wouldn't be able to hold these two sides of himself together. And he writes in Tasso, I think, a description of his own fears, as if to exorcise them by as it were, putting them into someone else and saying, well, actually, look, really, I'm not quite as bad as that. I can see them in a way they couldn't see themselves. I'm at least one step further on towards integration. The project of friendship in Goethe's life didn't just exist in plays and in novels. It had its centre in a relationship with the writer Schiller, Friedrich Schiller, and this was in fact this was one of the avenues of my own early enthusiasm for Goethe. I had been studying Schiller, who wrote a magnificent book, it's very boring in parts, called The Aesthetic Education of Humanity. This is a tremendous thesis, in fact, ultimately much inspired by his encounter with Goethe, but often very dense in its presentation. I had been reading Schiller's work, and I was told that it was an expression. The book was an expression of friendship. That he'd been very close to Goethe, and I read something about their early meetings with one another and how they got to know one another, and it seemed very moving. Here was an image of male intellectual friendship that seemed to spark my own longings. That wouldn't it be so lovely to have a friend like that? Schiller and Goethe had a very difficult encounter with one another. Goethe was the older by 10 years, and he was already into his mid-40s when he first got to know Schiller. Schiller had a reputation as a bit of a radical, someone who was very much outside the system of power and responsibility in Germany and wanted the world to know how angry and annoyed he was. But as he got older, his views on life rather changed. This was around the time of the French Revolution. And like many people of the time, many intellectuals of the time, for Schiller, the French Revolution was a lesson in conservatism. They started out very radical supporters and then were disenchanted by what they saw as the chaos of the revolution and became much more cautious in their social thinking. Goethe had heard this about Schiller. Now, Goethe, at this point in his mid-40s, was a very prosperous, very successful cultural figure. He occupied an important place within the political system, the power system of the state of Weimar. He had very respectable, a pretty respectable reputation, and he was a bit suspicious. Who is this Schiller person who's all about agitation and saying how rotten everything is and so on? What's he to me? And Schiller also felt quite intimidated. How can I dare approach this august person? Who am I to try and get to know and become friends with this highly established individual? And I think at that point, Schiller is, in a sense, an everyman in intellectual life. Which is, I mean, who am I to try and get to know this individual? Am I just the, as it were, the recipient of the words of wisdom of this other person? Or can I enter into a real relationship in which I've got a voice too, in which I might contribute something here, I might have something that they need? And it was gradually this recognition in Schiller's part that allowed him to form a relationship with Goethe. He wrote Goethe a letter, happened to come just about Goethe's birthday. And in this birthday letter, it's a kind of intellectual love letter, but what it's trying to do is show what Schiller understood was, you need me as much as I need you. He interprets Goethe as someone who needs friendship, who may appear self-sufficient, famous, successful, but who needs to be understood, who longs for closeness, for someone to complement, in the sense of complete him, in a way that he can't do for himself. He needs someone else to see him for what he is and show that picture back. Schiller thought of Goethe as a tremendously intuitive individual, someone who just has a great deal of spontaneity and naturalness, and it says that's fairly true of Goethe the man. Schiller saw himself as more reflexive, perhaps a bit more intellectual, a bit more of a theorist. And his hope, his loving hope, is that these two aspects can come together and be friends with one another. And this is, in fact, what actually happened. Goethe and Schiller became very close friends. And there was a series of statues made of them, showing them as well with their arms round one another and their outer arms extended out to the wider world. And Schiller writes, the statues were made later, but they are based on some lines that Schiller wrote in a letter to Goethe. It says, we're clasping one another, but our outer arms are extended out to the wider world. They had this extraordinary cultural ambition that they could see in themselves something that the world needed and that they could together give the world. And it was a combination of intimacy and generosity, which I'm very fascinated by. That they managed to see what they had as friends as something that was representative, that could be significant to others. And I think that was an extension of Schiller's original understanding of his relationship to Goethe. You need me as much as I need you. So this theme that I've been developing, the theme of friendship, mixes a number of disparate elements. It's partly to do with our relationship might partly be to do with our relationship to figures in the past. How can someone who lived in the 18th century matter in my life now? It might be a relationship between different kinds of thought, different kinds of aptitude, different kinds of interest. How can practicality be friends with poetic inspiration? It might be about encountering or finding what we need from other people. How can I become friends with someone that I'm intimidated by? These are all ways, I think, in which we're looking at the quality of relationships. We're looking at friendship, like love, is the name not just of things happening to go together, but of things going together extremely well in ways that inspire our tenderness and warmth. And I think that it's this notion of the quality of relationships that is the one that we should take most from Goethe. That we should be inspired by in thinking about his life. A quality of relationship isn't just about discovering a particular truth. It isn't just about uncovering a theory or getting to know a fact. It's a relationship between the person who knows, cares about it, and what that thing is. And you contribute as much to the relationship. So when I think about a work of art from the past, The question is not just what is it, but what is its relationship to me? Not as just as a consumer. Oh, it's just me. It's what's the relationship between the object as it is, me as I am. What is the relationship? Or an idea, the thoughts of Plato, the political and artistic philosophy of Schiller. They're objects, as it were, in intellectual space or in history. I'm an individual. What is the relationship between those? And how can that relationship be one, as it were, of friendship or love? And to me, that's the great intellectual project. That's the task of education. It is to improve the quality of our relationships to ideas or to people or to objects from the past. I'm going to leave it on that note, but we have a bit of time for questions.
In the business of acting, yeah.
Right. How does this discussion of I'll just repeat it in case people didn't hear. How does the emphasis on relationships and friendship join up with my jobs in the university, working in the Vice Chancellor's office and in the business school? Well, to me, it's central. I see myself as attempting to bring into a better relationship talking about business and humanities, really, is to bring into a better relationship the commercial drives of a society and the reflective, as it were, depth drives of the academic world at its best. I take the view that these two sides really need one another. That intellectual life it gains from its encounter with the necessities, the crudities, the intensities of and the troubles of the commercial world, but also that the commercial world has so much it needs help with that it can only get by addressing the issues that the humanities, in principle, are the spiritual home of. But my interpretation of recent history is that these two forces these two parts of society have, in a sense, been through an acrimonious divorce. They kind of come to hate one another or to be very suspicious. So we can see on the one hand a kind of Philistinism that would say, I just run these factories. What on earth could history or philosophy or poetry possibly mean to me? What a waste. How much money did you make? Just that sort of thing. I mean, obviously that's a slightly more fragile egoism now than it was, but there's still a sense of kind of resistance. Why should I, I've got other things to do. Why should I be interested in that? But on the other hand, I think a fear on the part of the humanities, sometimes disguised as a superiority, which is, well, we know too much, or we're too deep, we're too sensitive, we're too refined ever to really get involved. You're the crude other. You're the we sort of look down. You're the enemy. And I think that's a very understandable reaction in some ways, but I think it's the wrong answer, and that it is based to a certain extent on anxiety. And so I think that while recognizing the genuine tensions of this relationship, that a more civilized society would have really much better relationship here, and that involves a bit of development on both sides. It involves learning to talk across a gap and giving up a certain amount of superiority. It involves saying, well, if you can't understand me, it's my fault. If you don't understand what it is I'm trying to say, then I'd better try and get better at saying it, because I want you to understand. Or if someone says, look, I just can't be bothered paying attention to what you have to say, that can be recognized as a failing. It's not because the other person is being so difficult or strange. It's maybe I'm in denial. Maybe I don't pay attention enough to my own problems. And I think that absolutely right now, in terms of the larger economic difficulties of society, we're sort of at a point where there's more willingness, perhaps on the commercial side, to pay attention. But that in any case, there are always, the commercial world isn't just sort of one big homogeneous mass where everyone is robotic and thinks the same. There are many, many points of contact, I think, that could be developed here. So I'm very interested in taking some of the themes, the relationship themes that I've found in Goethe, and trying to put them to work in the relationship between the university and the wider world, and between the commercial aspects of the business school and the concerns of the humanities. Yes. We need to have a very long conversation about this. This is very, in a sense, of course. I mean, you're raising one of the hardest questions in life, which is however much one might esteem sort of ideas like friendship and love. Well, we all face loneliness, frustration, and so on. And you mentioned the work that I haven't mentioned, which is Faust. I mean, that's partly just bravado. I mean, can one talk about Goethe and not mention Faust? Well, why not? But actually, I think Faust is in a way a study of a really difficult relationship between the character Faust, who is in fact a very successful academic. He's sort of like the dean of arts faculty or theology faculty in the university, and on the other hand, this character Mephistopheles, who is a sort of devil, really, but who's a representative of the cruelest logical excellence. Mephistopheles is not just a sort of a tempter to sensual excess, which is how we might first of all imagine. Faust is the story of a man who sells his soul to the devil, sort of. There's a bargain, the Faustian bargain. You give up some essential part of your humanity for the sake of immediate gain. That's not quite how Goethe treats the story, but it gives one an initial sort of view of what's happening. But Mephistopheles, the devil, is not the tempter of sensual excess. He's actually the representative of a kind of intensely cruel rationalism. There's a point where Faust asks him, "What do I need to do to be happy?" And Mephistopheles says, "Eat beans, dig your own potatoes, defecate out of doors, never have any alcohol, never have any sexual excess, go to bed at 7 o'clock at night, rise with the dawn." And in a sense, it's true, but it's so unbearable. It's so boring. And what Mephistopheles hates is in a sense the arrogance of humanity. It's the irrational happiness-seeking parts of humanity that try to make themselves happy with wine, women, and song, and he thinks this is what's so contemptible about humanity. So in a sense, the relationship between Faust and Mephistopheles is a very difficult one. Mephistopheles can give Faust various things. He can help him look young. He can make him rich. He can get him girlfriends and so on. But also Faust wants other things that Mephistopheles can't give. And in a sense, it's a very difficult. It's an image of, perhaps one knows this. You can recognize this in reality, of a very difficult relationship where it's the tensions between them. It's the real conflicts and awkwardnesses that actually help Faust develop, or help oneself develop. One should almost perhaps have a category of the difficult friend, who's actually a good person to have in your life. And you don't want to, you often want to just wish they would just go away, but in another way you know that they are in fact helping you become, or they can potentially help you become a stronger and wiser person. And anyway, that's just to continue the friendship theme into the Faust situation. And there's another question. Yes. There are two issues there. Thank you very much for asking. There are two issues there. One is about a general point about how can you take ideas from the late 18th and early 19th century and just sort of drop them into the early 21st century, which would apply to lots of points that I want to make, and then a very specific one about about particularly the deterioration of the corporate world. Look, in part, I think the answer, the confession is, it's hopeful on my part. That is, I don't know if it's true that we can form a really good relationship between the corporate world and the world of the humanities. But I hope it's true, and I think that it's worth trying. The second thing is that I think the deterioration of the inner life of the corporate world, to the extent that that's correct, I see to some extent not as something that corporations have done to themselves, or not just that, but to some extent an outcome of a withdrawal, a removal of humane sympathy and humane ambition for the corporate world on the part of intellectuals and academics. So I think to some extent, if you look at the tradition of intellectual ambition from, say, the 1960s onwards, it wouldn't really be very interested in the question of how can we help people in business be slightly more humane versions of themselves? How can we, or for example, how can we be sympathetic to how can bourgeois life be improved? Or how can what should one want to do for people who have a lot of financial resources? I think that there hasn't been much imaginative investment in those sorts of projects for, I admit, quite understandable reasons. But I do think that withdrawal has had an unfortunate consequence, which is that perhaps through the 60s, 70s, and so on, it was imagined that the corporate world was sort of really not that strong, and that it was sort of going to be absorbed into a more benign society. But that, in fact, what was seen, and despite the current difficulties I think we'll continue to see, a really very vigorous commercial world, and that's probably not going to disappear, even though it's going through a lot of turbulence at the moment. And therefore, I think the issue of how we can try to address that, how we can try to find ways of talking between these areas, is an important one. Just on the very general thing about the relationship between the world of the 18th and early 19th century and the world of today, I think that, in a sense, I'm not knowledgeable enough about the 18th and early 19th century to have that problem. That is, what I'm interested in Goethe is what I'm interested in as a 21st century subject. It's not that I've undertaken this kind of wonderful historical immersion and understood Goethe as he would have understood himself. It's that I'm coming to him as someone who lives in the world of today, and really just bringing my own concerns, my own conceptual structure, my own longings and just into my study of him. So I don't have a lot of anxiety about that particular thing. It's really just a bigger anxiety about, well, maybe one doesn't understand the world of today, and to that, I think one just has to live with that. It's perfectly possible I don't have a particularly good insight, but that's just that is just what one has to, I think, just work with and try to come up with as helpful or as accurate an analysis, and that's for further discussion what a more accurate picture might be like. Thank you very much indeed.